Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files. Louie, you there?
I am Petal.
Can you hear me, Mother?
I am Petal. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm not bad.
Oh, we're going to start talking all like we're from North England.
I don't do that.
Well, make today's guest feel very distant, and given that he is very distant, possibly, am I right in thinking this is our guest which is from the furthest afield from where we are geographically?
Well, we have had an Australian guest before. We had our Australian chatting about the why the universe exists. Today we are joined by, no groaning in the back. This is another psychologist, because we do often have psychologists on the show. And we're joined by psychologist Brock Bastian, who is interested in, pain and misery, which is just right up the street for this podcast, because we love a bit of pain and misery. And so I say, welcome, Brock, and thanks for joining us.
Hello, how are you?
I mean, I'm a pretty miserable bastard, actually. So, anybody listening to this podcast will realize that I've destroyed 2 pieces of gardening equipment in about 10 minutes. So I'm having a bad day. How about yourself?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm miserable, but I wouldn't say I'm ecstatic either. Maybe just a moderate, middle of the road kind of guy.
Let's see what we can do with that. Let's see if we can either raise those spirits or take them further down. So again, I think it's one of your interests, or a big part of your interest as a social psychologist, as a psychologist, is this idea of happiness. But as I think Louie has touched upon there, you're interested in the kind of relationship between pain and happiness. So maybe as a kind of brief introduction in terms of where you're coming from, particularly in terms of this topic. What's your take on that then? Why should we be focusing our attention on pain when in fact we see lots of writings out there in terms of being happy and happiness being one of the kind of things we'd like to be? Apparently pain is an important part of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I maybe sort of start in with the second part of your comment first, which is that there's lots of writings out there, and I think there's broadly a big kind of happiness culture out there at the moment. I don't think it always existed quite to the extent that it does, particularly in Western cultures, perhaps more so. But I don't think it's always been quite as salient or as prominent as it is these days. I think that there is this kind of idea that being happy is the ideal state, and I mean it is broadly a more pleasurable state to be in. I think that's probably a fair thing to say. But whether it's the ideal state or perhaps even more problematic is this idea that we should be happy. That there's a kind of pressure or an expectation on ourselves, maybe from ourselves, maybe perceived from the society we live in, that being happy is really quite an important place to be. And of course, if we don't feel that we are achieving that kind of desired ideal, then of course we start to actually feel worse about ourselves. And the funny thing is that none of us are always constantly happy. I mean, you might be forgiven for thinking that perhaps some people are, given the way that, advertising works, or the way that people post Instagram photos on the internet, or, really a lot of the media we see seems to be promoting this idea that people are happy and we should be always doing things that activate that feeling of happiness. But really, most of us, many of the time, as Louie just admitted, that, there are plenty of times when we don't actually feel all that happy. And the problem with living in an environment which really values happiness, or overvalues, as I might say, is that when we do have these inevitable negative experiences in life, we actually start to reflect back on ourselves, and we start to think, well, I shouldn't be feeling this way. There's something wrong with me. What have I done wrong to deserve all of this? How come I'm not as happy as everybody else seems to be, or how everyone thinks that I should be? And that actually creates quite a problem. So we end up in this space where we're not very good at accepting our pains in life, our negative experiences.
And one question again is, what does it mean to be happy? Because we do often talk about this idea of I think often we talk about children and we say, oh, what would you want for your children? And they might say, oh, to be happy. Because it's this kind of term, and in that context, it's a term where, what does that mean? Contentedness? Does that mean living a meaningful, fulfilled life? Does it mean, having lots of positive emotions and so on? So one question is, well, what do we mean by being happy? It's a bit of a kind of catch-all term. And you've touched upon there, and that particularly in the very modern era, this idea of technology and media seems to promote it. Do you think that's one of the things behind it? Louie and I have talked before about positive psychology. It's one area of work that I work within. Yeah. And I'm assuming that's something that would you see yourself as working within that area of positive psychology, or to some extent would you see your work as countering what's been put forward in the work that's now been described as positive psychology?
Yeah, look, I think positive psychology, Martin Seligman and all of that entire line of work has been very, very valuable and continues to be. And the reason it's valuable is that it actually doesn't really send the same sort of message that I think perhaps a lesser well-defined positive psychology, perhaps which has made its way into maybe other forms of communication, perhaps. Maybe just a more simplified version of it, which has become that happiness is really a set of positive feelings, and that to be happy we need to feel positive. We need to feel positive feelings, and I think positive psychology did kind of start there in some ways, a little bit, but a little bit more than perhaps where it is now. And I think it's gone through a revisionist sort of series of phases where now it includes things like meaning and purpose and other sorts of things. I guess so I do see myself. Funnily enough, I do see myself or my work as fitting within this notion of trying to understand what it means to be happy. And so in that case, yes, it does fit within positive psychology, but also providing a bit of a counterpoint to, I think, what has become bad positive psychology, which is this focus on just rampant sort of positive feelings as the answer to happiness.
Go on then. Well, I want to say quickly before I leave it, pass over to you, Louie. And I think you're right. I think in some ways it's the media side of it that's kind of promoted that side of it. That's not always the academics have been as adept as they might be to kind of counter that and saying, well, actually, no, it's not all about being happy as such, or positive feelings or positive thinking. It's much more nuanced than that. And I think the academics have become better to kind of recognize that the range of experience that sits within this idea of well-being and what it means to lead a life that is meaningful and so on. So I think you're right with that one. So Louie, going to pick up on that one?
No, I wasn't going to pick up on that one per se. I was going to pick up on what you were talking about children, because I mean, there's an interesting TED talk on your website, Brock, where you talk about, for example, that mollycoddling children is basically creating a generation of narcissists. And I certainly, I must admit, that seems a fairly obvious conclusion. That, I'm not criticizing you. I'm criticizing kind of general parenting style. Seems to be that, trying to make your children happy all the time is in fact causing them immeasurable psychological harm, a lifelong harm. And it seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? I mean, you think that you're doing good, and therefore good cannot be from good, bad can't come. But it does seem to be the case. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there's that idea that we need to maximize our pleasures in life. We need to maximize our positive experiences. And so we want to see our kids always having the best of life, and that means feeling happy, never having to deal with hard times. We want to protect them from feeling sad and down, and from getting hurt, and from experiencing pain. So we've developed a very protectionist kind of approach. In fact, the kind of way, I mean, the way that we parent our children these days compared to how perhaps, well, at least how I was parented, and I think particularly even my parents were parented, is far more protectionist in terms of, well, avoiding all sorts of risks, but including the risk of being bullied, including the risk of failing, including the risk of not doing as well as they'd like to in all sorts of things. Everyone's a winner kind of idea. Everyone gets a sort of a scratchy sticker or something like that, no matter how well you do. And it's not real, and it kind of means that kids never have to deal with the downsides of life, the negative sides. And ironically, I guess that not only makes them less able to cope with those negative experiences when they do come their way, and feel, I guess, somewhat entitled to never having to have those kinds of experiences in life, but it also denies them, I think, what is really a far more grounded and, well, a far more important sort of sense of happiness. And that is really, I guess, the notion that happiness is really a mixture of both pleasure and pain. You can't really be happy in life if you just have pleasure. You need both sides of that equation to kind of work one against the other. And so in some ways, I think we're denying our kids more than just the option for development. We're actually denying them the capacity to really experience the fullness of life when they don't, for example, dismally fail. And that's a really important experience for people to have.
And that's what, yeah. And I think then the kind of notion of what it means to be resilient, what it means to kind of build that level of resilience, and it is through those kinds of experiences of, as you say, either failure or difficulty or challenge, adversity. So in which case then, given we're talking about the parenting side of it, then is there, and as a parent, and I'm sort of, as I'm listening, thinking, yes, as much as possible, we do have this idea that you want to protect your own children from those kinds of experiences. But are we talking about particular things then, parenting styles that are now more kind of culturally cultivated or supported, or is it something we can do differently to actually be more effective parents? Is it about kind of letting your children just obviously go and make their own mistakes? They need to go and make mistakes. Yeah. But I do hear people from different generations saying, "Oh, back when I was, a kid, we used to be let out, about whatever age it would have been, much earlier now, just pretty much spend the day just pottering around without being looked after at all." Is that something we would be encouraging to do now? Has the world changed sufficiently that wouldn't be appropriate? Is it just allowing more experiences of success and failure and dealing with both of those kinds of experiences in different ways, rather than trying to I do hear what you're saying when people go take part in sports days with these very young children. They often aren't rewarding the winners. Nobody loses. Yep. No one's described as not the winner of the race. And as parents, you're thinking, well, we are used to kind of thinking that person won, came second and third. That's just normality when you're looking at competitive races. So what can we be doing differently?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the sports day one's interesting. I mean, we sort of got to this idea where we believe that it's not nice to have winners and losers, and everyone should be treated equally. And then that in itself is a very nice idea and probably an important idea. But we've also, I think part of that comes from the idea that the experience of failure is something that people shouldn't be exposed to. If we thought that the experience of failure was somehow very valuable, then we'd be very happy to see. Maybe we'd be more sort of sorry for the people who won, that they didn't get that experience of failing miserably. And maybe if we started to value these sorts of experiences a lot more, we might start to recognise that really there's a different way of looking at it. And so you wouldn't want to protect your kids from those sorts of experiences. You want them to have them, and you want them to teach them to embrace them and understand them and to grow from them as well. But there's also, I have children, and even just in this small amount of time between them and when I was a child, I remember I would have a lot more freedom, and I didn't have a mobile phone, and I would be off on my bike for and come back at dinner time and things like this. And the funny thing is that people sort of say, well, the world's different these days, as you kind of hinted at. Maybe it's a more dangerous place, and we shouldn't let children out of our sight as much as we used to. But the evidence actually runs in the other direction. There's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the world's safer than it used to be. We certainly are exposed to a lot more of it via instant media than we used to be, and news feeds and all the rest. But there's Steven Pinker's got a wonderful book better angel of our nature, which is showing that the world is actually becoming a less aggressive and violent place. There's even some, I think it's David Finkelheuer, some statistics on child assault, which is dropping dramatically even since the 80s. So there does appear to be evidence suggesting that these sorts of things you want to protect out, that the worst case scenarios are not actually happening as frequently as they used to. But again, if you were to leave your child walk down the street, even as a 7 or 8 year old, you may well get reported. So there's a social expectation on us and how we should parent our children too.
So it's a bit of a line to walk, isn't it, in terms of what's appropriate. So in terms of your own research, particularly this idea of pain, then what's the role that pain has in the relationship to happiness? Is it something we should be seeking out? I mean, I'm being careful how I ask the questions here, but is it pain more than things like adversity, challenge, failure? Is there something particular about pain that's kind of drawn you in?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I became interested in pain because I thought that was really probably the holy grail of negative experiences. If we can examine how pain feeds into our happiness, physical pain, then it's a good place to start. My interest is broader, but and I mean, even when you say you catch yourself sort of saying I should be careful not to recommend people to seek out pain, I think that points at a really, really interesting how should I put it, a kind of misnomer in how we think about pain, because we often confuse pain with harm. And I certainly wouldn't suggest, and I don't think any of us would, that people should seek out harm. But pain is not the same thing as harm. We experience pain in all sorts of ways, or in various parts of our lives. I mean, if you consider every time you go for a jog, it's painful. And part of the reason you feel great after a jog is because it was painful. You consider running a marathon, and if you didn't, if the marathon wasn't painful, there'd be no point to it. You wouldn't train for it. You wouldn't get any credit for running it. You probably couldn't raise any money, in response to the challenge of running that marathon, and it would just really be quite pointless. So pain is actually much more evident and we seek it out much more normally than we ever think we do, because we tend to simply call those experiences good times.
What the ones that bring about pain?
Sorry?
You said that the experiences that bring about pain. So as in completing a marathon, or you have that phrase, no pain, no gain. So doing something where you actually have created a painful experience using those kind of descriptions, they themselves being the good times, or the bit just after where you're going, I feel better having done that and now it's finished.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, you can't have the bit afterwards if you don't have the bit before. That's the whole point. We expect in life, and this is, I think, where we've all gone wrong, we expect in life that we can have those experiences afterwards and skip the part beforehand, but we can't. It's not how we work. Endless pleasure becomes painful.
And I mean, I was going to say, I'm not a positive psychologist, and I currently work in a hospice with bereaved people, and I frequently get the impression that people are surprised that the more that you love someone, the more it hurts when they're not here anymore. And I think that surprises a lot of people, whereas it seems blindingly obvious to me that to wish away the pain is to wish away the love and the importance that they had when you were alive. And I really think it's a dual, it is a dual process, isn't it? And you really cannot have one without the other.
No. I mean, love just wouldn't be quite so powerful if it wasn't that you knew that you could lose the person that you were, that you loved, or completing a course wouldn't be quite so. The success of doing so wouldn't feel so grand if you knew for certain that it was going to happen anyway. The failure had to be there to make it seem like it was actually a great experience. So yeah, there's two sides, and we have to have one with the other.
You're not just interested in pain, though, are you, Brock? You're interested in because we were looking somewhat. There's this kind of you're interested in kind of morality as well. Is that right?
Yes. That's sort of the other side of my interest is morality, ethics, those sorts of things. Yeah.
Because I was looking at your which I think is a fantastic website for anybody listening. Then so it's brockbastian.com, which does outline the various pieces of work you've done and so on. So I was taken by the work on meat eating, because both Louie and I'm right thinking, Louie, Louie, you're not vegetarian, are you? No, you're not vegetarian. I'm sure you're not vegetarian.
I certainly am. I certainly am bloody well not a vegetarian.
No,
that's quite true.
And nor am I. But perhaps more than Louie, I would be someone who probably would ponder on the morality of it. As in, I'm someone who very much enjoys eating meat. I enjoy food generally. I'd find it. I occasionally eat vegetarian food, but very much, as in, I go try with one of these people who every so often, I eat too much meat, but I do enjoy it. And it's become part of a kind of a cultural thing if you are a meat eater. So I'm interested in this idea of, it makes me ponder more in terms of, should I really be, I'm sure I could go without eating it, but I enjoy it too much. So I'm curious by your work in this area, in terms of its relationship with morality as well. So tell us what you've done on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I'm equally curious, and probably, Matthew and I would fall into what you might call a kind of the category of conflicted omnivores, because I also am not vegetarian, but I am sort of constantly conflicted over my own meat eating, and so I find it I find it quite an interesting conflict, I suppose. It's where research becomes me search in some sort of way, but I think it's obviously not just about me or you, but it's about about 90 or 90, well, a large proportion of the population. It's a shrinking proportion. Vegetarianism is growing, veganism is growing, because I think our moral sensitivity to animals is growing. So we increasingly are recognizing the mental lives of animals. We increasingly are recognizing that the distinction between humans and animals is not quite as distinct as it used to be. I mean, it was only, not so many, 100 or so, maybe a couple of 100 years ago, where maybe we sort of still thought that that humans had souls and animals lacked souls. So this idea of animals being somehow fundamentally different to humans, not having something which is even morally relevant like a soul, whereas now we're starting to say, well, actually animal minds are very similar to our minds, and the reason that we give ourselves moral consideration is because of our capacity for fermentation, our capacity to think, and our capacity to feel. If we don't think and feel, we don't really worry too much about moral rights in those sorts of cases. Things that don't think and feel don't have moral rights. But animals do think and feel, and so it's a very conflicted category for us, because we do want to protect animals. In fact, very often most of us have exactly that inclination. We don't like to see animal harm. We often keep pets. We give them names and treat them as members of our family. We don't like it when we see other people harming animals, even wild animals, unnecessarily. Even things like over in the UK there, fox hunting and these sorts of things have started to become sort of spoken out against, because people don't like the idea of unnecessary harm against animals. But where this conflict arises is that we do like eating meat because it is a source of protein. It has been for a very, very long time in our human history, and protein is a very important part of our diet. There probably are other ways, perhaps even better ways to get that, but at this stage we still see it as primarily obtained through meat eating. And so that appetite that we have, which is, our appetites are very strong drivers of behavior, conflicts with our moral sensitivities, and you end up with this what we've called the meat paradox, which is this sort of paradox where we love animals, we want to protect them, but we also love eating meat, or at least we want to, and have a hunger for eating meat, and it's a very visceral sort of moral conflict for us.
And it is one that I do kind of experience, yet, is it because there's just instinctively I go, well, but then in the end I can reason it away or explain it away, saying, well, these animals are being reared for this. There's this, and again, as in, I imagine in this day and age there is no need for us to eat. I'm sure somebody who would be a vegetarian would say, absolutely, there is no need to do it. You can get all the proteins other ways. It's not needed. Yet, are we going to be talking maybe many, many, many years before that becomes the case, where that becomes more normal? Would it ever happen? Is it the case that it'll always be somewhat of a minority? You have people who are pescatarian who will say, well, we'll eat fish, partly maybe for some of the arguments you were saying there in terms of, oh, well, the so-called level of consciousness between certain animals is that fish are okay, but you get to a certain point where it's not okay. And I almost feel as though I'm just lazily saying, well, to me, I like it all. The part of me that likes to eat it and the taste of it seems to trump the other side of it, saying, oh, well, the moral side is maybe you don't need to. I'm wondering if there's ever going to be a point at which actually we just stop eating meat, or whether it's such a recent thing in kind of human evolution that you're either talking many thousands of years, or it'll never happen, where we're able to sort of put aside and say we're not going to eat meat because that's not part of what we do anymore.
Yeah, look, I don't know about the absolute answer to that question, but the idea that it's this sort of, I mean, our moral sensitivity to animals may indeed, well, probably is to a large degree becoming, at least in recent history, more evident. But so is our consumption of meat, and that's not driven obviously by the same factors, but rather by the increased wealth of nations. I think Americans have been eating a lot of meat for quite a long time, but as other nations like China and India start to become more wealthy, people can afford to eat more meat. So the consumption of meat, and as our population grows, its production via these quite horrendous forms of factory farming, which are really, I mean, they are hidden from us for a reason, because if we saw what that looks like, we don't eat meat very, very easily. It actually is very, very difficult. I actually worked in a chook abattoir when I was a university student, and I couldn't eat chicken. I still actually have a little bit of a qualm over eating chicken. It really viscerally kind of turned me off the idea, because of just you're confronted with what it is that happens to create that, and I think if we are confronted with that, we do change our behaviour. But I think the moderate answer to your question is that our meat consumption has been increasing globally, and really it's about considering, I think, more clearly what it is that the basis on which we make our choices about eating meat, and recognising that it is a moral choice, that we do make a moral choice when we eat meat, and that there are moral costs that we do care about at some level. All of us care about these things. And so at least acknowledging that helps us to make a more balanced choice. And so when we do decide to eat meat, maybe we'll decide to eat a little less of it. Maybe we'll see a little bit like the triple bottom line accounting. We'll start to value it more highly, and then therefore use less of it in our diets in some sort of way. And I think there's a sort of reducitarianism is quite a good step in the right direction, where if we just all ate a lot less meat, a lot of these issues around factory farming might be less prevalent as well, and it would be a lot better for the environment probably too.
I mean, I must admit, and probably people won't agree with me on this. I mean, my feelings are, I mean, I don't anthropomorphize animals. I have pets, I have cats, and but I don't see little people running around. And as somebody, I mean, I'm not a big eater of meat, and I'm a peanut butter sandwich man myself. But I see that chickens and cows and pigs, they're almost symbiotically part of the human species, and for as long as we eat meats, those animals will be in existence in some form. And I think any drive for vegetarianism, reductionism, is a drive that is we're going to take their genetic complement, we're going to stick them into bacteria, we're going to be pumping out their proteins in vats, and those animals will one day go extinct. And the question I often ask vegetarians is it better if cows and chickens and pigs go extinct, or that we eat them in factory farms? And I think that's basically, I mean, that's the way I see the choice of humanity in the future. It will be that those animals will go extinct. They will have no utility for us. We won't have them on farms, and we will use that land for other purposes. Is it better that they go extinct, or that they come along with us and, for as long as there's a human species?
Louie, there's a great documentary at the moment. I just watched it on the plane the other day called Chicken People. And it's about people who spend their entire lives raising these picture-perfect chickens. And they've become entirely dedicated to this art of perfecting the chicken. So So while the chicken people are still around, the chickens will still survive.
So this is kind of like the Planet of the Apes, isn't it? The dogs and cats go extinct, and we're going to have pigs and chickens and cows as our new pets. I mean, I guess there is a funny side to it. I mean, it's for psychologists to talk about morality. I think this is funny. This is a peculiar in and of itself. I mean, I've been reading a book on Peter Singer recently, and this is I must admit, I like lots of what Peter Singer says. I agree with 99% of what he says, but not about the animals, and again, I find that interesting. I find it interesting when we can have conversations about these things and there are still disagreements. I mean,
well, I mean, just two things. I mean, just to go back to I think the picture you paint of the factory farms versus extinction is quite an extreme one, obviously, and that's fair enough. But I think that one of the issues at the moment around our consumption of beef is methane gas and therefore climate change. So I think that reducing the number of these animals in existence would not be at all problematic. For them not to breed, for us not to breed them at the extent that we do. And I mean, we are breeding them as much as they are breeding themselves. Well, actually, we are breeding them far more than they are breeding themselves. So there is an unnatural kind of preponderance of these animals because we eat them and use them. So if they were to go back to some sort of, I guess more normalized level of existence in the world, I don't think that would be a bad thing. I don't know if they'd go extinct necessarily, but they might not be quite as prevalent as they are. That might be quite a good thing on a number of fronts. But in terms of your question about psychologists doing morality, I mean, it's a good one, and I think that I kind of describe it like psychologists started doing economics at some point too. And Daniel Kahneman got a Nobel Prize for that. I'm not sure that moral psychologists are going to pull a Nobel Prize. I'm not saying that, but the point there was that he kind of came along to the economists and said, look, it's all very well to have these rational models of human decision-making and behavior, but the fact is people aren't rational and they don't act rationally. And here's all of these little subtle ways in which they make their decisions that are not rational, and they don't follow the principles that you've outlined. And he was right about that. And I think the thing about psychologists doing morality is kind of the same sort of thing. The ethicists have set out these rational guidelines for reasoning, which are very important, and is an activity that should obviously continue, with great vigor. But psychologists have kind of come along and said, well, that's all very well and fine, but here's how people make moral decisions, and it's different. They don't always follow the guidelines. They're often conflicted and motivated, and sometimes their moral reasoning is not particularly consistent. So I think psychologists doing morality is kind of that kind of contribution, if you like.
And this sounds a little bit like this is your social psychology, isn't this? You're almost talking about the social psychology of morality rather than psychologists talking about morality.
You mean moral development?
Well, I mean, just the social, because I mean, I must admit, I mean, I'm not a social psychologist, but I do find social psychology to be one of the more interesting areas of psychology because it does tell us how human beings behave when faced with certain questions. And I think that's a kind of a, you can be skeptical or not of positive psychology. And I've said numerous times on this podcast that I'm a little bit skeptical of positive psychology. But I think social psychology can be very important in demonstrating, give human beings a moral choice, and this is how they behave, and that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, true. I mean, I think it's probably something that psychology does more broadly, but social psychology is the form of it which focuses on these sorts of questions. Absolutely, yeah.
And I think one thing you picked out there was this inconsistency as well, is that people are inconsistent. And that's a very difficult thing to kind of get a handle on, that you do recognize that you have these models of how people think and how they behave. And often people in the real world don't always necessarily act in some consistent way. And that's often a real challenge to get an understanding of. So I think that's something you pointed out, which was very helpful.
I was going to say, sorry, just going to finish my point that I don't have children. So you fuckers who've procreated There's going to be a lot more cows and chickens eaten because your fucking children have to have a sausage on the fucking Barbie. Whereas their sausage is just for me. So I just want to put that out there. That as a meat eater who likes a sausage, I'm not really crying about those pigs. But your ancestors, your descendants, sorry, are probably going to be eating a lot more than mine. So
you have the moral high ground.
Oh, don't give them the moral high ground, for goodness sake. We'll be fucked with that one. But the sausage one's an interesting one because, again, as somebody who, it's one of the classic piece of processed meat that people say, oh, one thing you should really avoid, just health-wise, and knowing what goes in them and so on. But yet, I'm someone who will just really crave a sausage or bacon or something like that, where you're going, actually, well, what is it about this stuff that you might say morally, recognize that even health grounds, I should avoid that, yet I will crave it? Is there something biological about that? Is it something very instinctive? Is it something else? Is it just the way it's sold to us? What are the various forces that are acting upon us that means that we can still act in a way we know things that are bad for us and we shouldn't do, yet we do them? And that to me is one of the biggest challenges we're trying to explain.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. I mean, I think a good analogy probably is sugar. Sugar serves absolutely no nutritional value at all for us, and yet we're all terribly addicted to it at some level. Perhaps it's the most sort of addictive, widespread addiction in the world today. And I mean that is all based on, like anything else, the reward value of sugar and the hit value of it, so that it triggers all of that sort of, triggers the dopamine, and it triggers the opioids. It triggers all of those neurochemicals, which are the same things that get triggered by, cocaine or cigarettes or, anything else that is quite addictive. And I think that certainly meat has a very high reward value to it. Fat is also a highly rewarding substance, as is sugar. So eating fat, maybe not pure fat, but eating fatty foods has a high reward value. And so it can be something which we can, I guess, even become a little addicted to in some sort of way. I don't think we talk about people getting addicted to sort of eating fat in the same way we might talk about people getting addicted to eating sugar, but there is that reward value there. Fat and sugar are two of the most rewarding substances. So I think that, it's very easy for us to act in ways which aren't necessarily in our own best interest nor anyone else's.
And if I could just jump in, I mean, sugar is, I mean, you said it's got no nutritional value, but of course, sugar is what flowers, give insects as a reward for pollination. And if you're a high energy, if your requirement is high energy, if you're a bee and you need to beat your wings X number of times every second, then sugar is actually a perfect, fuel for doing that job. It ain't great for us, higher organisms who are, further down the evolutionary line. But of course, once evolution has locked that in, flowers aren't going to start providing us with sausages without some really strange evolutionary pressures changes. So, again, unfortunately, that it's kind of locked us in a little bit into sugar. And you're right. I mean, it's not the best thing to be eating, but unless you're a bee, I mean, again, maybe we should all start take up flapping our arms, very fast.
Good luck with that, Louie. You have a go at doing that. But I was wondering, maybe to sort of bring this back towards where we started, or the flip side of it. So we're saying that pain and the discomfort and so on, that's an important part of actual happiness. And here we're hearing the flip side, the things that we think we crave or may give us a short-term hit aren't usually things that are going to contribute to our longer-term happiness. Was that something would make sense as a kind of flip side of the original idea of saying, well, you need to have the pain before you have those experiences of the good times, the happiness and so on. And similarly, conversely, perhaps, it's not by seeking out things which are going to be just on the very short term pleasurable, like a sausage or a hit of sugar it might be. They'll tend to probably be things where actually they're not going to make us happy. They're not necessarily going to even continue to feel pleasurable or positive because of the fact they're not giving us any kind of goodness.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly true. I mean, there's this, I suppose it's, chocolate is great until you've eaten too much of it, and then it becomes, it could become a torture in itself. So, highly rewarding substances are pleasurable, but again, you have to stop having them at some point. Then you need to contrast that with something else. So whether that sort of is in some ways the pain not only needs to precede the pleasure, but it also needs to follow the pleasure. We need to kind of move between these states. We need to work, to enjoy holidays. Endless holidays sound like they'd probably be ideal, but actually we get bored at some point. And, again, it's very hard to find purpose in lying on the beach. I mean, it's probably easy for a little while, but it's far more enjoyable if you've been working hard, for however long you've had to work hard for, and then you've had a little break and you've gone away and you really enjoyed that sort of space. So I think the idea that we have to sometimes work in order to gain pleasure in life, we have to put in effort, we have to deal with the downsides of things in order to experience the upsides, and then back again. It just seems to be how our emotional lives work. It's how we respond to rewards and punishments, if you like, and this. And I think it's some ways it's a really obvious point, but it's one that we seem to just have, it's surprising how much we've forgotten it, that you just can't sit on this plateau of pleasure. You can't kind of find this one plateau of constant pleasure and happiness being that sort of more positive feeling kind of happiness, where you just, while your days away in this kind of state of semi-bliss. It just doesn't work that way. It's impossible. Within our current psychology, we can't achieve that, but yet we seem to think that we should be able to, or that we can. But really, happiness is far more derived from sometimes taking on difficult things, sometimes doing things which we don't enjoy much, but which give us a sense of purpose or meaning. And sometimes that purpose or meaning is even bigger and grander when the thing we've done has actually cost us quite a lot in terms of pain, when we've had to put a lot of effort into it, when it hasn't been easy. When maybe we failed on the pathway to getting there, and that's what actually provides the meaning and purpose in those experiences. And then we can still go and enjoy those good times, the holidays, the chocolate, the rewards, and it's so much more enjoyable in the context of having put in all that effort in the first place and endured a bit of perhaps the sorts of things that sometimes we prefer not to have to endure.
I mean, would you say, I frequently say, Brock, that happiness is in fact overrated. I mean, would you agree with that?
Happiness as it is, I think the happiness is in the sorts of happiness that I'm targeting, yes, but I guess also I'm trying to redefine a little bit of what we talk about when we talk about happiness. And so in that case, well-being or just, that finding a place where we're comfortable in life, I think is very important. I think we've just become misguided in how we try and achieve that, and we keep seeking comfort in order to create that, and sometimes we need discomfort too. So I just think it's a misunderstanding, rather than the idea that we want to actually achieve a state which is actually perhaps something which provides the most we can find in life. But we need both sides of the coin to get there. That's the point, I suppose.
Absolutely. And I'm looking, as I mentioned before, to people listening, your website, brockbastian.com, and it mentions then your book. Then you've got a book coming out beginning of next year that's called The Other Side of Happiness. So I'm assuming very much exploring these ideas we've talked about today in terms of the ways in which we might achieve happiness, and it isn't all about just having lots and lots of good times. It's how you get there. So that's due out start of next year.
Yes, in January next year. Yeah.
So
obviously, obviously we haven't read it, so we can't necessarily recommend it yet until we've read it.
Well, I'm going to recommend it anyway. So there, because I think Brock sounds like the kind of person, if it's anything as good as he speaks about this stuff, and I'm sure it's probably even better because he'll be able to just do it in his own terms rather than having two idiots ask some silly questions about it. I'm going to recommend it. So there you go. 5 stars from me. A riveting read.
There you go. Well, I think we're going to say
my first review. It's my first review.
preview, before it's done. But we were going to say thank you for joining us then, Brock. It was wonderful to hear your slightly upbeat. It was more upbeat than I was hoping. I was hoping for more, tears and pain. But thank you very much for joining us. It's okay, and it's too late now to apologize. Anyway, the episode is in the bag. But thank you for joining us all the way from Australia.
No problem. It's been an absolute pleasure. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Brock, and no pain whatsoever.
No, good.
So we'll just have to. I'm always reminded. Actually, then you mentioned Daniel Kahneman before. He had the stuff where we need to be topped up with a little bit of pain, just to sort of make it better. He talked about, I think, people who go to dentists. He found that if they had a bit more pain at the end, but it wasn't quite as high as earlier pain, they wouldn't rate it as being quite so uncomfortable. So maybe just the end of it, I'll just go and smack my head against the wall, and it'll be really good.
Give it one from me, thank you. Right on that note, thanks, Brock.
Bye bye for now.
Bye bye.
No problem. Bye bye.